The restaurant sparkled with elegance, its golden chandeliers casting a warm glow over the polished tables. Laughter and clinking glasses filled the air, creating an atmosphere of lavish indulgence. In the center of it all sat Thaddeus Montgomery, a man whose presence demanded attention. His friends surrounded him, each one eager to bask in the light of his arrogance and sharp humor. They leaned in, hanging on his every word, their laughter echoing like a chorus of sycophants. "Did you see the way he stumbled last week? Pathetic." Thaddeus sneered, his eyes glinting with mischief. His friends erupted in laughter, feeding off his disdain like moths drawn to a flame. Just then, Elias, a waiter with a humble demeanor, approached their table. He held a notepad and a pen, ready to take their order. But before he could speak, Thaddeus cut in, his voice dripping with contempt. "What do you want? Is it time for the entertainment already?" He smirked, glancing at his friends. "Look at this guy, just a simple employee. Does he even know what fine dining is?" The laughter swelled, drowning out Elias's professionalism. He felt the heat rise to his cheeks, but he kept a straight face. Inside, a storm brewed, a mix of pain and frustration. He had battles to fight at home, but here he stood, determined to keep his composure. "Can I take your order?" Elias asked, his voice calm despite the tightness in his chest. Thaddeus waved a dismissive hand. "Just bring us the best wine you have. Make sure it's worth our time." His friends chuckled, relishing the humiliation they were inflicting on Elias. The atmosphere grew tense as Thaddeus, caught up in his arrogance, tipped a glass of red wine, sending it splashing across the table. The liquid cascaded down, staining Elias's shirt. A collective gasp echoed among the group, quickly followed by more laughter. "Oops, my bad, Elias. Were you hoping to keep that shirt clean?" Thaddeus jeered, his tone mocking. Elias stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the humiliation crashing down on him. But he took a deep breath, forcing a smile as he reached for a napkin. "I'll get that cleaned up for you," he said, his voice steady, hiding the turmoil inside. The laughter of Thaddeus's friends filled the space again, a cruel symphony that made Elias feel small. He moved to clear the mess, wiping the table with careful precision, as if each movement could somehow shield him from the scorn. As he worked, he overheard snippets of their conversation. "Can you believe he thinks he can serve us?" One friend snickered. Another chimed in. "What a joke! They should know their place." Elias clenched his jaw, forcing back the emotions that threatened to spill over. He had been in this position before, where the world felt heavy on his shoulders, but he would not let their cruelty break him. "Can I get you anything else?" Elias asked, his voice a mixture of professionalism and a hint of defiance. Thaddeus leaned back, a smug grin plastered on his face. "Just make sure you don't spill anything else. We wouldn't want to ruin our night with your incompetence." More laughter followed, but this time Elias's heart hardened. He could feel the weight of his struggles at home and the challenges he faced each day. Yet, he stood tall, refusing to let their mockery define him. In that moment, as the laughter echoed around him, Elias knew that he had a choice. He could either let their arrogance crush him or rise above it. And as the night wore on, he felt a flicker of hope ignite within him, a promise to himself that he would not be a victim of their disdain. Elias took a deep breath as he steadied himself after the embarrassing incident with Thaddeus. The laughter still echoed around him, but he chose not to retaliate in anger. Instead, he approached the table with a warm smile, determined to show grace in the face of cruelty. It was his job to serve, and he would do so with dignity. "Here is your appetizer, gentlemen," Elias said, placing the plates on the table. He avoided Thaddeus's gaze, but he could feel the man's indignation radiating from across the table. Elias focused on the other guests, hoping to find a moment of kindness in their eyes. As they began to eat, Elias felt a small spark of courage. He decided to share a piece of his life, something that had always brought him comfort. "You know," he began, looking around the table, "art has always been my escape. During tough times, it helps me express what I feel." Thaddeus looked up, a smirk still on his face. "Oh, really? You think you can impress us with your stories about art?" he scoffed. But Elias pressed on, undeterred. "Yes," Elias continued, his voice steady. "I remember when I was a child, I used to sit in the park and draw. It was a way to forget my troubles. Art gave me hope." The friends of Thaddeus exchanged glances, surprised by the sincerity in Elias's voice. They leaned in slightly, curiosity piqued, despite Thaddeus's dismissive attitude. "Hope? What do you have to be hopeful about?" Thaddeus interrupted, his tone sharp. Yet, beneath his bravado, Elias noticed a flicker of discomfort in Thaddeus's eyes. Elias took a moment to gather his thoughts. "Life can be hard," he said softly. "I have a sick child at home, and every day is a challenge. But through art, I find strength." The table went silent. Thaddeus's friends looked at each other, unsure of how to react. The laughter that had filled the air moments before had faded into a tense quiet. Thaddeus shifted in his seat, the weight of Elias's words beginning to settle in. "A sick child?" he repeated, his tone softer now, almost vulnerable. "Yes," Elias replied, his voice steady. "It's not easy, but I do my best. I work here to provide for my family, to give my child what they need." Elias noticed Thaddeus's expression change. The arrogance that often defined him seemed to waver, replaced by something deeper, perhaps a hint of empathy. Elias continued, "Sometimes, all we can do is hope for better days. Art has taught me to see beauty even in the darkest moments." For a moment, the tension at the table shifted. Thaddeus's friends were clearly moved by Elias's story. They looked at Elias with newfound respect, a feeling that had been absent just moments before. "Wow, I didn't know," one of Thaddeus's friends whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's really something." Elias smiled gently, appreciating their change in demeanor. "Thank you," he said. "It's not easy, but I believe we can find light in our struggles." Thaddeus remained quiet, his mind racing. He had never considered the lives of those he deemed beneath him. As he listened to Elias, a strange feeling began to creep into his consciousness. A sense of vulnerability that he had long avoided. "Maybe we take things for granted," another friend suggested, glancing at Thaddeus. "We should be more aware of what others go through." Thaddeus clenched his jaw, grappling with these thoughts. He had always lived in a world of privilege, untouched by the harsh realities that Elias faced. But now, as he listened to Elias speak, he felt something shift within him, a crack in the armor of his arrogance. I didn't know," Thaddeus finally admitted, his voice low. "I didn't think about it that way." Elias met his gaze for the first time, seeing a flicker of understanding in Thaddeus's eyes. "It's easy to forget," Elias said quietly. "But we all have stories. We all face battles." As the meal continued, the atmosphere around the table changed. The laughter faded, replaced by a deeper, more meaningful conversation. Thaddeus's friends began to ask Elias questions, genuinely interested in his life and experiences. And in that moment, despite the challenges they both faced, a connection began to form, one built on understanding, respect, and the shared human experience. As the evening continued in the opulent restaurant, Thaddeus Montgomery found himself lost in thought. He sat at the table, surrounded by his laughing friends, but his mind drifted to the earlier moments of the night. He recalled the laughter that erupted when he mocked Elias, the server, for being just a simple employee. Yet, as he reflected on Elias's quiet strength and the heartfelt story he shared, Thaddeus felt a strange conflict inside him. His father had often told him that true character mattered more than wealth. "Money can buy many things, but it cannot buy respect," his father would say. Thaddeus always believed he understood this lesson. However, witnessing Elias's resilience in the face of hardship forced him to question his own understanding. Thaddeus realized he had been living in a bubble, shielded from the harsh realities that people like Elias faced daily. The restaurant's atmosphere began to change. The laughter of Thaddeus's friends faded into the background as more diners turned their attention to Elias. He spoke about his love for art and how it provided an escape from his struggles. The way he spoke, with passion and sincerity, caught the attention of others nearby. Thaddeus felt a twinge of discomfort as he saw the focus shift away from him and his friends. One of Thaddeus's friends leaned in and whispered, "What's going on with you, man? Why are you so quiet?" Thaddeus shrugged, his eyes still on Elias. "I don't know. I think I'm starting to see things differently." As Elias continued, he hinted at the challenges he faced at home, mentioning his sick child. The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Thaddeus's heart raced as he listened. He felt the sting of his previous arrogance. The laughter that had filled the air moments ago now seemed cruel and misplaced. "Why do you continue to work here, Elias?" one of the diners asked, genuinely curious. Elias paused, his gaze steady. "Because this job helps me provide for my family. Every plate I serve is a step toward keeping my child healthy. Art is my passion, but responsibility is my reality." Thaddeus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The pride he once felt about his wealth and status began to feel insignificant. He glanced around, noticing his friends were no longer laughing. They were listening, and for the first time, he felt the weight of their shared silence. In that moment of introspection, Thaddeus confronted an uncomfortable truth. He had allowed his privilege to blind him to the struggles of others. The stories of hardship he had dismissed as mere tales were now alive before him, embodied by Elias. Thaddeus's heart sank as he recognized the superficiality of his life. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck?" he heard himself ask, his voice surprisingly steady. Elias turned to him, his expression one of surprise. "Stuck? Every day. But I keep pushing forward for my family. It's not about where you start, it's about how you finish." The words struck Thaddeus like a bolt of lightning. He had always thought he was above such struggles, yet here was Elias, a man who faced challenges with grace and determination. Thaddeus felt his arrogance begin to crack, revealing a vulnerability he had long buried. As the night wore on, Thaddeus found himself wanting to know more about Elias. He wanted to understand the man behind the server's uniform, the artist with dreams that extended beyond the walls of this restaurant. Slowly, a sense of empathy grew within him, a feeling that began to melt away the layers of arrogance he had built around himself. The restaurant buzzed quietly, the diners now engaged in conversations sparked by Elias's story. Thaddeus could feel the shift in the air, a collective understanding emerging. He was no longer just a wealthy patron. He was part of something larger, something that connected all of them. Humanity. As he absorbed the moment, Thaddeus realized that perhaps it was time to step out of his bubble. The journey ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, he felt ready to embrace the truth about himself and the world around him. As the dinner reached its climax, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. Thaddeus Montgomery, who had always worn arrogance like a badge of honor, felt something stir inside him. Looking at Elias, he noticed the way the server held his head high despite the humiliation he had faced. Thaddeus's heart raced as he realized that he could no longer ignore the man standing before him. With a sudden burst of courage, Thaddeus stood up from the table, his friends' laughter fading into stunned silence. The other diners turned their heads, curious about what was happening. He cleared his throat, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him. "Elias," he began, his voice shaky but firm. "I need to say something." Elias looked up, surprise etched on his face. "What is it, sir?" he asked, keeping his voice steady, unaware of the storm brewing within Thaddeus. Thaddeus took a deep breath, his friends gaping at him in disbelief. "I'm sorry," he said, the words tumbling out as if they had been trapped inside him for far too long. "I've treated you poorly. I mocked you, and I didn't see you as a person. You deserve better than that." Gasps filled the restaurant. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Elias's eyes widened, and for a moment, he couldn't find the words. "Thank you for saying that," he finally replied, his tone soft. "It means a lot." Thaddeus's friends exchanged glances, confusion clouding their expressions. One of them, Jake, leaned forward, unable to contain his incredulity. "What are you doing, Thaddeus? This isn't like you," he hissed. But Thaddeus was already lost in the moment. "I know it's not like me," Thaddeus replied, his gaze still fixed on Elias. "But maybe it's time I changed. Maybe it's time I learned a thing or two about humility." His heart pounded as he spoke, a mix of fear and exhilaration coursing through him. Elias stood still, his professionalism slipping away to reveal a flicker of hope. "Humility is something we all need to practice," he said quietly. "We all have our struggles." Thaddeus nodded, understanding the weight of those words. The other diners watched, captivated by the unexpected turn of events. The restaurant, once filled with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses, was now wrapped in a heavy silence, the air charged with emotion. Thaddeus's friends continued to stare in disbelief, but he felt a sense of clarity wash over him. He could feel the eyes of the diners upon him, but he no longer cared about their judgment. "I realize now that wealth doesn't define a person's worth," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "It's the respect we show to each other that matters." Elias smiled faintly, his posture relaxing as he sensed the sincerity in Thaddeus's words. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong," he said, his voice steady. "I appreciate your apology." The moment hung in the air, a fragile connection forming between the two men. Thaddeus glanced at his friends, who were still struggling to comprehend what was happening. "I don't expect you all to understand," he said, turning to them. "But I need to be better. We all do." Jake scoffed, unable to hide his disdain. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. But Thaddeus ignored him, focusing instead on the man who had quietly endured his cruelty. As the silence lingered, Thaddeus felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He glanced at Elias again, and for the first time, he saw a fellow human being, not just a server. "Let's start fresh," Thaddeus suggested, a hint of hope in his voice. "Maybe we can learn from each other." Elias nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth lifting into a genuine smile. "I would like that," he replied, his eyes shining with gratitude. In that moment, a spark ignited, changing the course of their lives. The laughter of Thaddeus's friends faded into the background as he began to understand that true connection came from empathy, respect, and a willingness to change. In the days following the unexpected apology, Thaddeus Montgomery found himself in a whirlwind of emotions. He sat in his lavish office, staring out of the large window that overlooked the bustling city. The view was as magnificent as ever, but it felt hollow now. The laughter of his friends echoed in his mind, mixed with the image of Elias's pained expression. Guilt settled heavily on his chest. "What was I thinking?" Thaddeus muttered to himself, his fingers tapping nervously against the polished wood of his desk. He recalled how he had belittled Elias, how easy it had been to mock someone who seemed different from him. "I can't believe I treated him that way." Meanwhile, Elias was experiencing a shift in how people saw him. After the incident at the restaurant, patrons began to approach him with kindness. "Elias," an elderly woman said with a warm smile, "I heard your story the other night. You are truly inspiring." Elias felt a sense of respect he had not felt before. "Thank you, ma'am. I just want to share my journey. It's not easy, but it's worth it." As he shared his tale with more diners, he noticed they listened intently. He spoke about his sick child, the struggles of making ends meet, and how art had been a light in his life. Each word carried weight, and each listener seemed to feel the truth of his experience. Back in his office, Thaddeus decided it was time to learn more about Elias. He picked up his phone and hesitated before dialing the restaurant's number. After a few rings, The calm voice of the manager answered. "Hello, this is Marco. How can I help you?" "Marco, it's Thaddeus Montgomery. I was hoping to speak with Elias. Is he available?" "Sure, let me check." After a brief pause, Marco returned. "He's here, Thaddeus. I will let him know you are calling." Thaddeus's heart raced. He could hear a faint voice in the background as Marco called for Elias. Moments later, Elias picked up. "Hello, this is Elias." "Elias, it's Thaddeus. I wanted to talk to you about what happened the other night." Elias's breath caught for a moment, but he quickly steadied himself. "What is it, Thaddeus?" "I realized I was wrong. I want to understand more about your life, about the challenges you face. Can we meet?" There was a long pause before Elias responded. "I suppose that would be okay. I'll be at the cafe near the restaurant at noon tomorrow." "Great. I will see you then," Thaddeus replied, feeling a mixture of hope and anxiety. The next day, as Thaddeus waited at the cafe, he reflected on how different this meeting was from his usual encounters. He was nervous, but he knew it was important. When Elias arrived, Thaddeus stood up and offered a genuine smile. "Thank you for meeting me, Elias," Thaddeus said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Of course," Elias replied, sitting down. His expression was cautious, but there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "I've been thinking a lot about what I said and did. I want to know more about you and your family," Thaddeus started, his voice steady. Elias narrowed his eyes slightly. "Why do you care now? You mocked me in front of your friends." "I know, and I can't take that back," Thaddeus admitted. "But I want to change. I want to learn about your struggles and your strength. It might help me understand myself better." Elias considered this for a moment. "It's not an easy life, Thaddeus. My child is sick. I work hard to provide for my family, and sometimes it feels like too much." "I can't imagine how hard that must be," Thaddeus said, his voice sincere. "But I want to help. I want to support you in any way I can." Elias looked at Thaddeus, searching for honesty in his eyes. "If you really mean that, then maybe we can talk more. It won't be easy." "I'm ready for it," Thaddeus replied, feeling a spark of hope. As their conversation deepened, Thaddeus felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crumble. He realized that understanding Elias's life was a step toward understanding his own. Their connection began to form, rooted in respect and a desire for change. In that small cafe, two very different lives began to intertwine, each man learning from the other, forging a friendship that promised to reshape their paths. The sun filtered through the large windows of the community center, casting a warm glow over the room. Thaddeus Montgomery stood beside Elias, a paintbrush in hand, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was a far cry from the opulence of the restaurant where they first met. The atmosphere here was filled with a sense of belonging as people gathered to share their stories and creativity. "Are you ready?" Elias asked, his smile encouraging. Thaddeus nodded, glancing at the blank canvas in front of them. "I think so. But what if I mess it up?" Elias chuckled softly. "That's the beauty of art, Thaddeus. There are no mistakes, only new directions. Just let your feelings guide you." Taking a deep breath, Thaddeus dipped the brush into vibrant blue paint. As he made the first stroke, he felt a sense of freedom. The paint flowed as he transformed his feelings onto the canvas. Elias watched, offering tips and encouragement. "See? You're already starting to express yourself." Thaddeus felt a warmth spread through him. "I never thought I could do this. I've always been focused on, other things." He hesitated, thinking of his past arrogance. "Art helps you see the world differently," Elias said, mixing colors on a palette. "It opens your eyes to emotions you might not even know you had." As they worked together, Thaddeus began to redefine himself. He remembered the man he had been before, arrogant, dismissive, and blind to the struggles of others. He looked at Elias, who had become a friend, and felt grateful for this chance to learn and grow. "Do you really think I can change?" Thaddeus asked, unsure. Elias paused, his expression serious. It's not just about change. It's about understanding and connecting with others. That's where true strength lies. Thaddeus reflected on those words, feeling a shift within himself. He had always defined himself by his wealth and status, but now, standing beside Elias, he felt a different kind of power, a power rooted in humility and empathy. As they continued to paint, the community center buzzed with life. Families gathered in corners, sharing laughter and stories. The walls, once bare, began to fill with colorful expressions of hope and resilience. Thaddeus glanced around and felt a sense of belonging that he had never experienced before. "Look at how everyone is coming together," he said, pointing to a group of children painting together. "It's amazing." Elias smiled, pride shining in his eyes. Art brings people together. It shows us that we all have something to share. Thaddeus turned back to the canvas, the colors blending beautifully under his brush. "I want to help create more spaces like this," he said, determination growing in his voice. "Places where people can share their stories and support one another." Elias nodded, encouraging him. "That's a great idea, Thaddeus. You have the influence to make a difference." As they painted, Thaddeus found himself lost in thought. He realized that the restaurant, once a place of privilege, could transform into a community hub. It could be a place where stories of resilience and dignity were celebrated, where everyone felt welcome. "Elias, what if we host art nights at the restaurant? Bring people together to share their art and stories," Thaddeus proposed, excitement bubbling in his chest. Elias's eyes lit up. "That's a fantastic idea. It could change the way people see each other." Thaddeus smiled, feeling a sense of purpose. "And I want you to be a part of it. We can work together to build this community." As they put the finishing touches on their painting, Thaddeus felt a sense of accomplishment. He had come a long way from the man who had once mocked Elias. Now, he stood beside him as a friend, ready to embrace a brighter future. In that moment, as they admired their collaborative artwork, Thaddeus knew that true wealth lay not in money or status, but in the connections they made and the compassion they showed to one another. Together, he and Elias looked ahead, ready to create a world filled with understanding and hope. Share this story if you believe that connection and creativity can transform lives for the better. Leave a comment about a moment when you found community in unexpected places, and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one.